My name is Linda Harper. I was 57 years old and living in Springfield, Missouri, when on a wet Thursday evening in March, with my hands still damp from rinsing supper plates, I told my husband and my 2 grown sons that I was leaving. Roy laughed first. Derek gave that crooked little grin he used when he thought somebody was being dramatic. Travis looked down into his iced tea and laughed with him. I stood there in my own kitchen, under the yellow light over the sink, hearing the men I had fed, covered, defended, and carried for nearly 30 years laugh at me like I was making a joke I didn't understand. What none of them knew was that 2 weeks later, the same people would be standing in a parking lot outside my new apartment, calling me with voices so thin and desperate I almost didn't recognize them, begging me to come back before everything they had built their pride on came apart in their hands. I'm not telling you this because I enjoy what happened after. I don't. If I'm honest, there are still mornings when I wake up before dawn and for a split second think I need to check the service calendar, start the coffee, set out Roy's blood pressure pill, and make sure the invoices in the blue folder are ready for deposit. Then I remember where I am, I remember the quiet, I remember I don't belong to that life anymore. And the strangest part is, leaving didn't begin with anger. It began with exhaustion so deep it felt clean. That's how a lot of women leave, I think. Not with shouting, not with a slammed door, just a long silence that finally reaches the bottom. For years, if you had driven past our house on South Fremont around 5 in the morning, you would have seen the kitchen light on before anything else on the block. The neighborhood was older, nothing fancy. Split-level houses, chain-link fences, Bradford pear trees that bloomed too hard in spring and smelled faintly rotten if the wind shifted wrong. We had lived in that house for 28 years. The mortgage started out feeling impossible, then ordinary, then somehow still hanging around by the time my hair had gone more silver than brown. I always woke first. I would stand on the cold linoleum in my slippers and fill the kettle even though Roy liked the coffee maker, because I liked the sound of water heating in a quiet house. The dog, Murphy, would circle once near the back door and then lie down where he could watch me. I'd open the fridge, take out eggs or biscuits or leftovers depending on what we had. There were almost always bills tucked into the ceramic bowl by the phone. Electric, gas, property tax notice, something from the insurance company, one of the boys forgetting to update his truck registration again. Life doesn't usually fall apart all at once. It frays in familiar places first. Roy and I had been married 34 years by the time I left. When I met him, I was 23 and he was 26, broad-shouldered and sunburned and so sure of himself it felt like shelter. He was doing HVAC service calls then, working out of a borrowed van with a metal toolbox that rattled every time he hit a pothole. I was at St. John S. in medical records, still half convinced I might go back to school and do nursing if I could find the time and money. We were ordinary people with ordinary hopes. A house, a few kids, enough breathing room to stop watching the checking account every day. Roy had hands people trusted. That sounds old-fashioned, but it's true. He could look at a furnace and understand it in a way that made other men step back. He knew compressors and coils, old ductwork, failed ignitions, all of it. He could kneel in a crawl space in August and come out black with dust and still grin like he'd won something. I loved that about him. Back then, his confidence didn't feel like ego. It felt like steadiness. So when he said one evening that if we were ever going to get ahead, he needed to stop making money for other people and start his own company, I believed him before I believed myself. I should have noticed even then that when Roy talked about we, he usually meant my labor and his name. But I didn't, that's the truth. We started Harper Heating and Air out of our garage when Derek was 6 and Travis was 3, and Emily was still in a high chair pushing Cheerios into the floor. We had one van, one used ladder strapped to the top with old tie-downs, and a card table in the garage that served as a desk until the first winter freeze. I took calls during nap time. I wrote appointments on a wall calendar big enough to cover the pantry door. I learned part numbers by ear because half the men Roy dealt with on the phone talked too fast and assumed I knew less than I did. I balanced the checkbook at midnight while cartoons played low in the other room because one of the kids had fallen asleep on the couch. Everybody likes the story of the hardworking man who built something from nothing. Very few people ask who was sent. Anding behind him, handing him every brick. I learned payroll before I learned QuickBooks. I learned sales tax deadlines, county permits, vendor relationships, and what words made an angry customer calm down enough to stay on the line. I learned that if you tell a woman with 2 toddlers and a broken air conditioner in July, "I'm so sorry, ma'am, I know this matters," instead of "we'll get there when we get there, she will remember you." I learned who paid on time and who needed a second invoice. I learned how to stretch one check across 5 needs and still make it look easy when Roy came in asking whether we could afford another set of gauges or an ad in the church bulletin. There was one winter, I think 1998, maybe 1999, when our account dropped so low I sat in the car outside the bank for 10 minutes before going in because I was ashamed of being recognized. It had rained the night before and all the slush in the parking lot had turned gray. I had Emily in her pink coat in the backseat and Travis was crying because he wanted a snack I hadn't brought. I remember holding the deposit slip and thinking, this is what fear really is. Not drama, not screaming, just knowing $3 in either direction can change the whole day. I sold a gold bracelet from my grandmother that winter to make payroll. Roy never asked where the money came from. He just said, I knew you'd figure something out. At the time, I took that as trust. Now I hear it differently. When the kids got older, the business got bigger. Roy hired a second technician, then a third. We moved out of the garage and into a low brick building near Sunshine Street with a metal awning that popped in the heat and a front office nobody else wanted because the carpet smelled like old smoke. I painted that office myself on a Saturday while the boys helped Roy move parts shelves in the warehouse and Emily sat cross-legged on the floor reading horse books. Pale beige walls, cheap blinds. A second-hand desk I bought from a church rummage sale. I brought in a lamp from home because the fluorescent lights gave me headaches. That office became the center of my life. I knew every drawer, every file, every stain on the carpet. I kept peppermints in the top left drawer for customers and little packs of crackers for when one of the boys stopped by hungry between jobs. I kept birthday cards for vendors who'd done right by us. I kept stamps, extra reading glasses, 2 pens I liked and everyone else claimed not to touch, and a yellow legal pad where I wrote things nobody thanked me for remembering. When Roy says now that he didn't realize how much I handled, people look at him like he's confessing some small oversight. It wasn't a small oversight. It was my whole life disappearing in plain sight. At home, I carried everything the business didn't. Derek was the loud one, the kind of boy who filled up a room before he was old enough to shave. Travis was quieter, quicker to notice the cracks in other people's moods. Emily was born tired of everyone's nonsense. She had that look even at 10, like she was already deciding which family stories she would not repeat in her own life. I packed lunches, signed permission slips, sat on aluminum bleachers with bug spray running down my ankles, and made casseroles that stretched farther than they should have. Roy's mother, Lorraine, moved in with us after her second fall. That was supposed to be temporary. Almost everything that changes a woman's life begins as temporary. Lorraine stayed 3 years. She wasn't cruel, not exactly. She was proud, and illness made her mean in strange, embarrassed little ways. She hated needing help in the bathroom, hated the walker, hated the pills I lined up in the plastic organizer every Sunday night. Some mornings she would look at me while I tied her robe belt and say, I used to do everything myself, you know. And I would say, I know, even when my lower back ached and the office phone had already started ringing. I drove her to cardiology appointments. I learned which yogurt she'd eat and which one she'd pretend to choke on just to punish me for buying it. I washed sheets after accidents she never apologized for. I sat up with her when she got confused after dark and thought the house wasn't hers. Roy loved his mother, but he loved her in short visits, in gestures, in standing at the doorway and saying, "You doing okay, Mom?" before heading back out. I loved her in the only way that counted then, by staying. Nobody claps for staying. That's one of the hardest things I had to learn. The work that keeps a family alive rarely looks important while it's being done. Years passed that way, the business got stronger, the kids grew up and came back around in different shapes. Derek went to work with Roy full-time after community college didn't take. Travis bounced around a little longer, then settled into installs because he liked working with his hands and not having to make conversation. Emily moved to North Carolina after she married a decent man named Ben who listened more than he talked, and I loved him for that from the start. By the time I was in my 50s, Harper Heating and Air had 6 trucks, a maintenance membership program, a steady list of commercial accounts, and a reputation in town for showing up when we said we would. People thought Roy had built a small local success story. He had. So had I. Only one of us got introduced that way. The first crack I can name now came so quietly I almost missed it. It wasn't one big event, it was a shift in tone. Roy started saying things like, the boys are the future of this place. That sounds harmless if you hear it once. But if you hear it enough and nobody ever says you're part of the future too, something cold starts moving under your ribs. At first I told myself not to be sensitive, men say foolish things, pride makes them careless. Then Derek married Kelsey, who had shiny hair and expensive coffee habits and a way of speaking confidently about businesses she had never built. She wasn't a bad person in the simple sense. She was just the kind of woman who thought if something looked easy, it must not be difficult. She had worked in a real estate office for a few years and liked to use words like streamline and leverage while standing in rooms other people had held together with their bare hands. The first time she came into my office and said, "Linda, you should really let software do more of this for you," I smiled and said, "Software doesn't know that Mrs. Pickens gets frightened when strangers come inside if her daughter isn't home." Kelsey laughed like I'd made a sweet little old lady comment. "Still," she said, "systems matter." I remember looking at her over my reading glasses and thinking, "Honey, you are standing inside the system." I should have said it. I didn't. Then came the small exclusions. Roy and the boys started having shop meetings in the warehouse without me. If I asked what was decided, Derek would say, "Nothing major, Mom," without looking up from his phone. Roy stopped bringing paperwork home because, as he put it, we're trying to keep work at work. What that meant in practice was that he and Derek would discuss company changes in corners, and I would find out when I needed to clean up the consequences. One morning I came in and found Ashley, a 26-year-old hire from a friend of Kelsey, sitting behind the front desk using the headset I'd picked out 3 years earlier. "Oh," she said brightly, "Roy said I'd be up here helping with dispatch and customer communication." Helping? That word can rot a whole room if it's used wrong. I stood there with my purse still on my shoulder and said, "Customer communication." Ashley smiled, nervous now. "Yes, ma'am, just trying to take some pressure off you." I walked into Roy's office before I said something unkind to the wrong person. He was bent over a parts order with his glasses low on his nose. "What is she doing at my desk?" I asked. He didn't even look guilty, he just sighed like I was making his morning harder. "We talked about getting you some help." "No," I said, "you talked around me long enough for another girl to show up at my desk." "She's not a girl, she's 26. That's the kind of reply a man gives when he wants to avoid the point entirely. I shut the door behind me and kept my voice low. "What is she doing with dispatch?" Roy leaned back. "Linda, you've been saying for years you're tired." "I've been saying I'm overworked." "Same difference." "No," I said, "it is not." He rubbed his jaw. "The boys think we need to modernize." And there it was, not I think, the boys think, as if fatherhood had become a management philosophy. I should have walked out then, I know that now, but after decades of building something, you don't stop loving it just because other people stop honoring your place in it. So I stayed. I trained Ashley. I showed her how to prioritize no cool calls in July, how to tell when a customer was really angry and when they were scared, how to leave enough room in the schedule for the emergencies Roy always swore would never happen. I did it because leaving people to drown has never come naturally to me. And because some part of me still believed decency would be recognized. It took me too long to learn that usefulness and respect are not the same thing. Around that time, Roy started changing at home too, not in the dramatic way people imagine. No lipstick on collars, no secret late-night perfume, just a steady thickening of self-importance. He would sit at the kitchen table scrolling through truck listings while I cleared dinner and say things like, "Derek's got a real head for growth," as if the years I spent preventing collapse were somehow less valuable because they didn't look like ambition. Travis mostly stayed quiet, but he had begun to copy Roy's silences. He let things happen in front of him without interrupting them. That hurt almost more. Emily saw it sooner than I did. Daughters often do. One Thanksgiving, after Roy had spent most of dinner talking about the business like it was a father-son inheritance story that had appeared from heaven complete, Emily helped me stack plates by the sink and said quietly, "Mom, do they ever say your name in there?" "In where?" I asked, though I knew. "In the story," she said. I rinsed a dish that was already clean. Your father gets excited, men like hearing themselves talk. Emily handed me another plate. That's not what I asked. I looked at her then. She had my eyes and my way of standing slightly turned, like she was ready to leave before a room asked too much of her. Not often, I said. She nodded once. I don't like that. Neither did I, but disliking something and believing you're allowed to change it are two different stages of a life. It's easy to become invisible inside routines that depend on you. The very fact that you are reliable becomes the excuse for why nobody has to look directly at what you carry. Every month I did payroll. Every quarter I dealt with tax filings, workers' comp audits, insurance renewals, maintenance reminders, vendor statements, warranty registrations, bank reconciliations, and every single phone call that began with, "I hate to bother you, but," because bothering me had become the most normal thing in the world. I knew which tech forgot to turn in fuel receipts, which customer's husband had died and would need extra patience, which supplier would waive a rush fee if I called before noon and used his first name instead of the company line. Roy knew systems because I translated chaos into order before it reached him. The boys knew confidence because I softened the cost of their mistakes before they had to face them. Home ran the same way. I remembered birthdays, I replaced smoke detector batteries, I scheduled the dog's shots. I knew where the extra furnace filter sizes were stored in the hall closet because Roy never remembered which return grate fit what. I knew Murphy would panic in thunderstorms and need the TV turned up to drown out the weather. I knew the mortgage drafted on the 12th, the water bill had to be nudged because the city office always posted late, and Roy's blood pressure medicine needed refilling 3 days before he would ever notice. There is no trophy for being the memory of a family. There should be. I think what hurt the most wasn't that they depended on me. Dependence can be tender when it's acknowledged. What hurt was that they depended on me while talking as if I contributed almost nothing. They used the stability I gave them as proof that I wasn't under strain at all. If the laundry is done, nobody says she must have worked hard. They say, good, the laundry's done. If the business survives every crisis, nobody says, who prevented the crisis from becoming a collapse. They say, looks like we're doing fine. That winter, Roy started having lunch meetings with a CPA named Mark Ellison. I knew Mark. He handled a few tax questions for us over the years. Every time I asked what was changing, Roy said some version of just cleaning a few things up before busy season. He made it sound technical, boring, the kind of thing I didn't need to concern myself with. One Tuesday afternoon, I came back from the post office and saw a thick envelope on Roy's desk that hadn't been sealed yet. I wasn't snooping. I need to say that because I still hear Roy's voice accusing me of dramatics. I was dropping off the certified mail receipts and the envelope was right there, open under the desk lamp with my own last name typed across the top. Harper Mechanical Holdings, LLC. That wasn't our company name. Our company name was Harper Heating and Air, Inc. I stood there a second too long enough to see pages clipped together, long enough to see Roy's name, Derek's name, Travis's name. Not mine. My stomach went hot and empty at the same time. I picked up the first page. I only got halfway through before Ashley walked in carrying a stack of maintenance agreements and froze. Sorry, she said. Roy asked me to. It's fine, I said, though my voice sounded far away to me. I put the pages down exactly where I'd found them, but something in me had already moved. That was the afternoon I started understanding the difference between being left out and being erased. I waited until supper to bring it up because I wanted witnesses. There comes a point in a marriage when privacy stops being safety and starts being a trap. We were all there that night, Roy at the head of the table, Derek and Kelsey on one side because they'd dropped by after some school fundraiser planning, Travis across from me with his work hoodie still on, and me with a casserole dish between my hands like it was the only stable thing in the room. I don't remember what we were eating. I remember the green beef. NS were overcooked because I'd forgotten them in the pot while watching the driveway. I saw some paperwork today, I said. Roy kept chewing. Derek reached for the rolls. Kelsey glanced up first. What paperwork? Roy asked finally. Harper Mechanical Holdings. He took a sip of tea. That's just restructuring. Restructuring what? The business, Derek said before Roy answered, for growth. Growth, there was that word again. Growth always seemed to mean I was expected to shrink. I set my fork down. Why are your names on it and mine is? Kelsey shifted in her chair. Travis stared at his plate. Roy gave me the look he used when he wanted me to stop something before it became public, forgetting we were already sitting in the middle of public. Linda, he said, it's legal organization, not personal. I almost laughed then from the pure nerve of that sentence. I used my inheritance to keep this company alive in 2008, I said. I've run the office for 28 years. I've done payroll, dispatch, books, collections, insurance, taxes, customers, warranties, all of it. And you're telling me it isn't personal. Derek let out a breath through his nose like I was being difficult. Mom, nobody is saying you didn't help. Help? I turned and looked at him fully. Help. He leaned back, you know what I mean. No, I said, I don't think I do. Roy put his glass down a little too hard. Can we not do this over supper? When were you planning to do it? I asked, after everything was signed. It's just cleaner this way, he said. The boys are out in the field, they're building the next phase. And what exactly have I been doing? I asked. Nobody answered. That silence told me more than any argument could have. Then Kelsey, who I don't think meant to be cruel in the way she came across, gave a little shrug and said, honestly, Linda, maybe this is a good thing. You've worked so hard. Most women your age would be happy to step back and let the next generation take over. There are sentences that split a life in two. That was one of them. Not because it was the worst thing anyone had ever said to me. Because it said plainly what they all had been living off for years, the belief that my sacrifice was useful only as long as it was quiet. Roy must have seen something change in my face because he softened his voice then, which somehow made it worse. Nobody's pushing you out. You can still answer phones, handle a few things, whatever you want, but this, he tapped the table with 2 fingers, this part needs to be set up right. I said very quietly, so the company belongs to you and the boys. Roy shrugged. On paper. And me. You're my wife, he said, like that was supposed to be enough. I waited 1 second more than I needed to. Then I said, I'm leaving. Roy laughed first, exactly the way you laugh at a child who says she's running away with a sandwich in a backpack. Leaving where? He said. Derek smiled. Mom, come on. Kelsey actually gave a nervous little chuckle. Travis said, let's all calm down. But he was smiling too, just barely, enough. I looked around that table and saw it all at once. Not just what they were saying, what they believed, that I had nowhere else to go, that after a lifetime of being needed, I would mistake that need for love forever, that my loyalty had already proven them right. I picked up my plate, carried it to the sink, and said, you'll see. No one followed me. That may have been the loneliest part. I stood at the sink rinsing casserole off china I had registered for at 23, and behind me I could hear them talking again, lower now, Roy saying something about me being tired, Derek saying, she'll cool off, Kelsey whispering, I didn't mean anything by it, and the familiar scrape of chairs on the floor. Their voices blended into the sound of a family moving on from my pain before it had even fully landed. I should have screamed. I think some people would have felt better if I'd screamed. It would have made my leaving easier to explain later. But I didn't. I dried my hands, took Murphy out into the backyard, and stood under the porch light while he sniffed the wet grass. My chest felt hollow, not broken, hollow, like somebody had been slowly removing pieces from me for years and I had only just noticed how much space was missing. There was a wind moving through the bare branches. Somewhere a neighbor's television was on behind a screen door. The whole world looked ordinary, which felt insulting. I sat in my car in the garage after everyone went to bed and cried without making a sound. Not because I was trying to be strong, because I had no voice left for the kind of grief that doesn't come from one event, it comes from accumulation, from every time you made yourself smaller to keep peace, from every time you let "that's just how he is" replace "that shouldn't be happening." I looked at the cardboard box's S. Tacked by the freezer, Christmas decorations, old school projects, a crockpot we never used, and thought, if I stay now, I teach them how to finish disappearing me. That was the night I stopped hoping to be understood and started planning to be free. I didn't sleep more than an hour. By 5 in the morning, I was back in the kitchen out of habit, but I didn't start coffee for Roy. I just stood there holding the counter edge and listening to the refrigerator hum. There is a strange dignity in the first tiny thing you stop doing for someone who never noticed you were doing it. Roy came in around 6:30, hair flattened on one side, and looked surprised not to see his mug waiting by the pot. "You still upset?" he asked. I almost smiled at that word, upset, like I had misplaced a receipt. "I'm not upset," I said. He opened a cabinet, frowned when the mugs weren't where he expected because I had moved them months earlier and he still hadn't learned, then finally found one. Good, because last night got out of hand. "It got clear," I said. He poured coffee. "You know I didn't mean anything by it." "Then why did you do it?" He sighed. "Linda, I can't do this before work." That was Roy's gift, turning other people's pain into bad timing. He kissed the top of my head on his way out, the way he had for years, and I stood still while he did it. That was when I knew something had ended for good, not because I felt rage, because I felt nothing. The next morning, I went to the bank on my lunch break and opened an account in my own name. The woman who helped me was Paula Jenkins, whom I had known for 20 years through school fundraisers and church circles and the soft, private economy of women who keep towns running. She looked at me once over the paperwork and asked, gently, "You want statements mailed somewhere else?" I swallowed hard, yes. She nodded like she understood more than I had said. Maybe she did. I rented a post office box that same day. Then I called a lawyer whose number Emily had given me 6 months earlier, just in case, back when I was still pretending I was collecting information the way people buy umbrellas on sunny days. Her name was Marcia Keene. Divorces, property disputes, small business unravelings. Her voice on the phone was steady, almost kind. "When can you come in?" she asked. "Tomorrow, if possible." "Tomorrow at 10. I almost said I needed more time. Women like me are trained to apologize before taking up professional help. Instead, I wrote the appointment in my planner and said, "I'll be there." That afternoon, I started noticing everything with a different set of eyes, not the eyes of a wife making allowances, the eyes of a witness. I saw how Roy signed papers without showing me. I saw how Derek interrupted Ashley the same way he interrupted me. I saw how Travis deferred to whoever spoke loudest. I saw the stack of unentered vendor receipts on Roy's desk, the maintenance agreements Ashley had misfiled because nobody had explained the old commercial accounts, the unanswered voicemail from the county inspector asking about permit renewals. I saw all the pressure points because I had built them. And I knew, with a calm so deep it frightened me, that if I stepped away, they would not know where to put their hands. I should have felt triumphant. I felt tired. Marcia Keene's office was on the second floor of a brick building near the courthouse, above a title company and across from a sandwich place that smelled like bacon before noon. I sat in her lobby holding my purse in both hands like I was trying to keep myself from floating apart. The carpet was blue. There was a fake ficus in the corner. A daytime judge show played on low volume from the receptionist's desk. Marcia was in her 60s, compact, silver-haired, and blessedly unimpressed by male bluster. She listened without interrupting while I explained the business, the marriage, the paperwork, the house, the inheritance, the years. She only stopped me once to ask, "Was your inheritance ever deposited into a joint business account?" "Yes." "Do you have records?" "Some." She nodded, "Get all of them." Then she said the sentence that changed my posture in the chair. "Linda, whatever story your husband has been telling himself, you are not optional here, not legally and not financially." I stared at her. "I'm not on the company paperwork." "That's not the same as not having rights," she said. "It just means he hoped you wouldn't ask." Hope, again, men build whole castles on the hope that a woman will be too tired, too loyal, too embarrassed, or too frightened to push a question all the way to its answer. Marcia gave me a list: tax records, bank statements, insurance documents, mortgage paperwork, any evidence of unpaid labor, underpaid labor, capital contributions, household commingling, ownership changes. She told me not to announce anything else until I had copies, not to threaten, not to expel. Ain just to gather. I left her office with a yellow folder and a feeling I had not had in years. Direction. That weekend, I started moving like a spy inside my own life. It sounds dramatic when I say it now, but it didn't feel dramatic then. It felt practical. I copied documents at the office when Ashley was at lunch. I scanned old statements from the filing cabinet at home after Roy fell asleep in his recliner with the television on. I took pictures of titles, policy numbers, loan documents, corporate filings, and the old ledger where I had once noted, in careful black ink, "Grandma bracelet proceeds deposited for payroll, do not forget." I found more than I expected. Roy had not only filed restructuring paperwork, he had opened a line of credit secured partly against company receivables and partly against our home equity. He had shifted percentages to the boys without ever sitting down with me, and in an email chain printed by accident and left in the wrong folder, I saw one sentence from Mark Ellison to Roy that turned my stomach cold. If Linda is transitioning out of daily operations, removing her from payroll this quarter will simplify classification. Transitioning out. As if I were retiring from a hobby. As if decades of work could be reduced to a neat little phrase between men. I sat on the edge of my bed that night and read that sentence 4 times. Roy was brushing his teeth in the bathroom. I could hear the faucet running, hear him spit, hear the normal sounds of a husband getting ready for sleep, like the man in the next room had not been quietly rearranging the architecture of my life. I should have confronted him then with the paper in my hand. But I didn't want another denial. I wanted freedom more than I wanted an argument. There's a difference. The planning phase took 11 days. I counted later. In those 11 days, I found a 1-bedroom apartment on the north side of town above a florist shop run by a widow named Jeanette who liked me immediately because I asked practical questions instead of performative ones. The place had ugly beige carpet, a narrow galley kitchen, a small balcony overlooking the parking lot, and windows that let in afternoon light. It smelled faintly like old paint and someone else's detergent. To me, it smelled like possibility. I bought a shower curtain, 2 towels, a dish rack, a lamp, and a cheap folding table. I moved things little by little so nobody would notice all at once. 1 box of winter clothes, a stack of books, my grandmother's quilt, the blue ceramic bowl Emily made in middle school, family photos I chose carefully because I wasn't trying to erase anyone. I was trying to stop being erased myself. I also applied for a job. That part surprises people when they hear the story. They assume I left with nothing but nerve. I had nerve, yes, but I also had 40 years of skills and finally, at 57, enough respect for them to put them on paper. A supplier rep named Miguel had once joked that if Harper Heating ever lost me, every service company in Greene County would line up to steal me. 2 days after the dinner table laugh, I called him. "Still know anybody who needs an operations manager?" I asked. There was a pause. Then he said very carefully, "Linda, are you asking for yourself?" "Yes." Another pause. "Can you meet tomorrow?" By the end of that week, I had an offer from a mid-size regional outfit called Ozark Climate Solutions, better salary than Roy had ever paid me, health insurance in my own name, structured hours, an office where my title would be printed on the door. I sat in my car after the interview and laughed for the first time in days, not because anything was funny, because I had forgotten what it felt like to be valued by people who were not emotionally invested in minimizing me. I should have been devastated. Instead, I was beginning to wake up. At home, I became quiet. Roy mistook quiet for surrender. That's another thing men like Roy do. They think a woman has accepted her place when in fact she has simply stopped reporting her thoughts to them. He grew almost cheerful. He talked about spring tune-up season, about Derek wanting to add a maintenance tech, about Travis maybe taking over installs full-time. He did not mention the paperwork again. Neither did I. Sometimes he would pat my leg while we watched television as if physical familiarity could cover contempt. I let him. Derek came by one evening with Kelsey and the kids. Kelsey was talking about repainting the front office in something more modern, and Derek said, "Yeah, Mom, we need to get away from that old mom-and-pop vibe." I smiled and asked whether he wanted more mashed potatoes. There are moments when silence is not weakness, it is storage. I stored everything. I made lists, not angry lists, practical ones, passwords that belonged to me personally, accounts that were jointly held, medications, my own doctors, the exact amount in the savings account, the date my first paycheck from Ozark would land, the afternoon Jeanette would hand me the apartment key, the day movers could take the bedroom set I had bought with money from my bookkeeping side work years earlier. I went to church that Sunday and sat through a sermon on forgiveness that made me so tired I nearly walked out. People love forgiveness because it allows everyone to skip directly over accountability. Afterward, a woman I had known for years touched my arm and said, "You look worn out, honey." I almost told her everything in the fellowship hall next to a crockpot of little sausages. Instead, I said, "I think I've been carrying too much." She nodded like that was ordinary. Maybe for women my age it is. The day I left was a Monday. That matters to me because Mondays had always belonged to work. New calls, new invoices, new promises. I liked the symbolism of taking one back. I woke before sunrise, showered, dressed in navy slacks and a cream sweater, and packed the last 2 boxes into my car while Roy slept. Murphy watched me from the back door with his gray muzzle tilted, confused. I knelt and buried my face in his neck so I wouldn't cry. Leaving the dog hurt almost more than leaving Roy. People laugh when you say things like that until they've had to walk away from a creature that never once treated them like they were replaceable. At the office, I put an envelope on Roy's desk. Inside was my written resignation, effective immediately, and a separate list of active jobs, outstanding payroll deadlines, vendor contacts, and account notes detailed enough that any competent adult could have kept the place running if he wanted to learn. I did not sabotage a thing. I left everything cleaner than I found it. Then I went to Ashley and said, "I'm leaving today. There are notes in the shared folder about dispatch priorities. If you don't understand something, ask Roy." She looked stricken. "Wait, today?" "Yes. Is this because of me?" "No," I said, and I meant it. "But learn this now while you're young. If men start calling your full job helping out, believe the warning early." Her eyes filled so fast it startled me. Maybe she had already begun to understand more than I'd given her credit for. Roy came out of his office holding my letter in one hand like it might be a prank. "What is this?" "My resignation." He frowned. "Stop. Excuse me. This isn't funny." "It wasn't funny when you laughed either," I said. Derek, who had been in the warehouse, came up front at the sound of our voices. Travis followed slower. "Mom," Derek said, half exasperated, half amused, seriously. "I picked up my purse." Roy lowered his voice, the way men do when they want to sound reasonable in front of employees. "Linda, don't do something stupid." I looked him straight in the face and said, "The stupid thing would have been staying after you made yourself clear." His jaw tightened. "You can't just walk out." "I just did." That moment lives in me more clearly than my wedding day, not because it was dramatic, because it was the first time in years I heard my own life belong to me while I was speaking it. I walked out of Harper Heating and Air at 9:12 on a Monday morning carrying one plant, one framed photo of my children when they were small enough to still believe I could fix everything, and a cardboard box with my sweaters folded inside. No one stopped me in the parking lot. They still thought I'd come back. By noon, Roy had called 3 times. I let it ring. Derek texted, "You're making this way bigger than it is." Travis sent, "Can we at least talk tonight?" Roy called again and left a voicemail. "Linda, enough now. Come home after you cool off. We'll sort through it." Sort through it, another phrase men use when they mean, return to your place and we'll decide what crumbs of dignity we can spare. I drove to Jeanette's building, carried my things up 1 flight of stairs, unlocked the apartment, and stood in the middle of the empty living room with the keys in my hand. Outside, I could hear the florist delivery van backing up and somebody laughing on the sidewalk below. Sunlight fell across the carpet in a wide, bright stripe. I had not been alone in a space that belonged only to me in 34 years. It was terrifying. It was glorious. I sat on the floor because I had no couch yet and ate crackers from the box while my phone buzzed on and off beside me. Around 4, Emily called. I answered hers. "Did you do it?" she asked. I looked around the apartment. Yes. There was a long exhale on the other end. Okay. That's all you're going to say? No, she said, but I wanted to give you 1 second where nobody asks you to explain yourself. I started crying then, real crying, the kind that bends you forward. Emily stayed on the phone while I cried and did not rush me. Sometimes love is just that, somebody making room for the truth to finish arriving. The first night. Alone, I slept on a borrowed air mattress with my coat rolled under my head because the movers weren't bringing the rest until Wednesday. Every little sound in the building startled me, pipes knocking, doors opening down the hall, a siren somewhere far off. I kept reaching across the bed and touching nothing. Freedom is not comfortable on the first night. Nobody tells you that part. It's cold and unfamiliar and full of the habits you no longer need but haven't yet stopped rehearsing. I woke at 3 a.m. convinced I had forgotten to set up the maintenance reminder emails. Then I remembered that was no longer mine to hold. I whispered into the dark, let it fall. And I meant the business, but I think I meant more than that. The next morning was my first day at Ozark Climate Solutions. Their office was cleaner than ours had ever been, all brushed metal and branded polo shirts and a front lobby that smelled like fresh coffee instead of old paper. I almost turned around in the parking lot because I suddenly felt ancient, displaced, foolish. Starting over at my age is not inspiring when you're living it. It is humiliating and brave at the same time. The owner, a man named Russell Dean in his early 40s, met me at the door with a handshake and no condescension. "We're glad you're here, Linda," he said. "I've heard about you for years." I didn't know what to do with a welcome that clean. He showed me my office, a small room with a window, a desk already set up, a computer login with my name, a legal pad, and a little plant from someone in HR who liked making people feel settled. I stood there staring at the nameplate on the desk for a second too long. Operations manager. Not wife. Not helper. Not still answer phones, handle a few things. I touched the edge of the nameplate with one finger like it might disappear if I moved too fast. I should have felt vindicated. Mostly, I felt grief for how long I had accepted less. Meanwhile, Harper Heating and Air began to wobble almost immediately. Not because I sabotaged it, because systems do not transfer through bloodline or confidence. They transfer through learning, and they had mocked the teacher. By Wednesday afternoon, Derek had called 8 times. Ashley texted me from her own number. Roy says the payroll portal isn't taking his login. The county inspector called again. Do you know where the commercial maintenance renewals are saved? I did know, of course I knew, but I had left notes, detailed notes. Nobody had read them because reading instructions from the woman you underestimated feels too much like admitting she mattered. I replied only once, everything you need is in the handoff packet and shared drive. Good luck. Roy came by the apartment that night, but Jeanette had already been warned not to buzz him up. She called and said, "There is a man downstairs looking like a thundercloud, want me to tell him anything?" I looked out through the blinds and saw Roy pacing near his truck, shoulders set, one hand on his hip. He looked angry, not sorry. "Tell him I'm not home," I said. She chuckled softly, "Even when you are." "Yes." "Good for you," she said and hung up. The second week was when the laughter finally turned to fear. I know this because their voices changed. Roy's messages lost their edge and turned ragged. Derek stopped sounding insulted and started sounding panicked. Travis called once at 9:40 p.m., and I answered because something in his silence on the line made me sit down before he spoke. "Mom," he said, "I know you're mad." "I'm not mad, Travis." "Then what are you?" I looked at the lamp on my side table and thought about how strange it was to have a lamp nobody else had chosen. "Done," I said. He was quiet a long time. Then he said, "It's bad here." "What is?" "Everything." I waited. He exhaled. The payroll got held because Dad didn't know the security questions. Ashley scheduled 2 no-heats on top of a commercial rooftop job. Derek ordered the wrong condenser units for the church project. Mrs. Pickens fired us because nobody called her daughter first. The city permit expired on the Maple Grove install. and he swallowed. Dad bounced his blood pressure meds refill because the joint account transfer didn't hit. That last part caught me. The joint account. Yeah, didn't you move your paycheck? Yes. Another silence. He said you were trying to punish him. I looked out at the parking lot. Rainwater shone under the security light. No, I said, I'm trying to stop disappearing. Travis made a small sound then, not quite a sob, not quite a sigh. I didn't know it was this much, he said. I know, I told him. That might have been the first honest conversation we'd had in years. 2 days later, I learned one of the deeper truths. Marcia called me in to review preliminary documents Roy's attorney had sent over in response to separation filings she had initiated on my behalf. I sat across from her desk while she flipped through disclosures with colored tabs marking the ugly parts. That's when I saw it. 6 months before the dinner table scene, Roy had met with counsel about restructuring the company in anticipation of succession planning and potential marital volatility. Potential marital volatility. I actually laughed when I read it because if I hadn't, I might have thrown the folder. He had been planning for me to become a problem before I even knew he was erasing me. Marcia looked over her glasses. You all right? No, I said, but I'm interested. She slid another page forward. There's more. He explored removing you from payroll and health coverage as part of the transition package. The room went very still around me. Transition package, I repeated. Yes. I pressed my hand flat on the table because it had started to shake. All those years, all those mornings, all those sacrifices wrapped in casseroles and spreadsheets and doctor appointments and emergency calls and skipped dreams. And somewhere in Roy's mind, I had become a line item to be managed out. That was the day my heartbreak turned into clarity. Before then, part of me had still been asking why. After that, I stopped asking why and started asking what now. Because the truth was not that Roy had suddenly changed. The truth was that success had hardened the parts of him that saw care as background noise and himself as the main event. And the boys, especially Derek, had learned manhood from watching gratitude skipped over in real time. The pattern was bigger than one dinner, bigger than one company. But I didn't need to solve the whole history of women's labor to save my own life. I just needed to keep walking. On the 14th day after I left, they begged. That is not me exaggerating for effect. They begged. I was leaving Ozark after a long day of reorganizing maintenance membership workflows when I saw Roy's truck, Derek's truck, and Travis's truck parked crooked along the curb outside my building. For one wild second, I considered driving past and sleeping somewhere else. Then I saw Travis leaning against his hood, looking like he hadn't slept, and something in me steadied instead of panicked. I parked across the lot and got out slowly. Roy walked toward me first. He looked older than he had 2 weeks earlier, not broken, just stripped of certainty. We need to talk, he said. I shut my car door. You've needed to talk for years. Derek stepped forward. Mom, come on, don't do this out here. I almost smiled at that. Public discomfort had suddenly become important to them now that I wasn't trapped in private. This is fine, I said. Roy ran a hand over his face. The business is in trouble. I said nothing. He continued, we've got dispatch issues, customers threatening to cancel contracts, payroll messes, account holds with Ferguson, and I asked. And we need you back. There it was, not romance, not remorse, need. The old me might have melted at that, might have heard value where there was only dependence. But 2 weeks of peace, new work, legal clarity, and distance had done something to me. I could finally hear language for what it was. Derek cut in, look, maybe we didn't handle things right. Maybe. I looked at him, maybe. He blew out a breath, fine, we didn't handle it right. Roy glanced at him, irritated even now by apologies he hadn't authored. Travis finally spoke, Mom, please. That word from him hurt the most because it was real. I crossed my arms, not defensively, just to hold myself together. Why am I here? Roy stared at me like he couldn't believe this was requiring explanation. To come back. In what role? What do you mean, what role? Your role? My role, I repeated, the one where I answer phones and handle a few things while you and the boys own the future. Derek looked away. Roy's face flushed. That's not what I meant. It's what you said. We were trying to set things up. You were trying to set things up without me. That was business. No, I said quietly, that was betrayal. For the first time, nobody interrupted me. I took a breath and kept going because some truths, once finally spoken, need room to stand upright. You laughed when I told you I was leaving because none of you believed I had a self outside of serving this family. You thought I was bluffing because you thought I had nowhere to put a life that didn't revolve around cleaning up after your choices. And now that the office is drowning and the house feels harder and the bills don't sort themselves and the customers don't trust you the way they trusted me, now you want to call what I did important. Roy's eyes flickered, shame maybe, or anger that shame had arrived at all. He lowered his voice. I'm asking you to come home. Home? That word hit me harder than expected because I had loved our home, the porch in summer, the hall. Way growth marks on the laundry room door frame, the drawer where I kept birthday candles and spare keys. Home had not betrayed me, the people inside it had. I looked past him at the trucks lined up in the lot, then back at my husband of 3 decades. I am home, I said. Derek made a frustrated sound. So that's it, you're just going to let everything fall apart. That was the sentence, the one that settled the whole thing. Let everything fall apart. As if I were responsible even now for preventing the collapse of what they had insisted I didn't build. I stepped closer to him, calm as I have ever been in my life. No, I said, I'm finally letting it belong to the people who claimed it was theirs. Nobody spoke. Then to my shock, Roy's shoulders dropped, not in surrender, in fear. What do you want? He asked. There are questions a woman spends years not letting herself answer. I answered this one. I want a divorce, I said. I want my share of what I built. I want my name off any liability you created without me. I want peace. And I will not come back to make your life easier while you keep telling the story as if I was never central to it. Travis covered his mouth with his hand and looked down. Derek's face went hard, then blank. Roy just stared at me, as if he had finally encountered a version of me that made his old script unusable. He said very softly, "You'd really do this?" I almost laughed again. I already did, I said. Then I walked past them, up the stairs, and into my apartment without looking back. When I closed the door, my whole body started shaking. Strength on the outside does not cancel grief on the inside. That's another thing people don't understand. I leaned against the door and cried so hard I slid to the floor, not because I regretted it, because finality has weight and I was carrying it alone. Jeanette knocked 20 minutes later and handed me a paper plate with 2 warm biscuits and sliced ham. You don't have to talk, she said. I smiled through swollen eyes. Bless you. She looked toward the door. Men leave tire marks when they don't get what they came for. They gone. I think so. Good, she said. Eat while it's hot. There is healing in being mothered by someone who isn't trying to own you. After that confrontation, the hidden truths kept surfacing in layers. Roy's attorney shifted tone. Fast. Once Marcia established my legal claim to marital assets, documented business contributions, undercompensation, and the inheritance trail, the confident language from their side became suddenly cooperative. It turns out dismissing a woman's work is easier at the dinner table than under discovery. I learned Roy had been paying Derek bonuses off the books some quarters while telling me the company needed to tighten spending. I learned Kelsey had been pushing for Ashley to take over more of the office because she thought family companies need less emotion. I learned Travis had never been comfortable with any of it but had chosen peace over honesty because that's what quiet sons do in houses run by louder men. I learned Emily had seen much more than I knew. She admitted she stopped bringing concerns to me years earlier because every time she did, I defended Roy out of habit. That one hurt. Children watch what you normalize, even adult children do. The divorce process was not elegant, let me say that plainly. Anybody who tells you mature endings are all wisdom and closure has either never lived one or had enough money to buffer the mess. There were meetings, account reconciliations, sharp letters on expensive stationery, nights when I sat at my new table with legal pads spread out and thought I might be sick from the sheer administrative burden of reclaiming a life. Royce swung between apology and accusation. One voicemail began, "I know I took you for granted," and ended with, "You're tearing this family apart over paperwork." Another said, "If you just come in for a month, we could get stabilized and then figure the rest out." Figure the rest out. Meaning, resume your post while we decide how much of you to keep. I stopped listening after the first 10 seconds and saved everything for Marcia. Derek was angrier. He sent one text that said, "You're choosing strangers over blood." I almost replied, "No, I